Picture this. A 44-year-old Gen Xer sitting at a kitchen table somewhere in Ohio, staring at a bank statement she never expected to see. Her mom passed 2 months ago. The house is sold. The accounts are settled. And now there's a wire transfer sitting in her checking account. More money than she's ever seen in one place in her life. She has no idea what to do with it. She hadn't thought about this moment once in the 44 years leading up to it. That scene is happening right now, quietly, millions of times over, and most people, including most financial commentators, are completely missing what it actually means. Here's the thing. I've been sitting with this story for a while, and I keep coming back to the same feeling. We talk about the stock market every single day. We obsess over inflation numbers, Fed rate decisions, crypto volatility, housing data. And meanwhile, the single largest transfer of financial assets in recorded human history is happening in slow motion, one estate closing at a time. And it barely gets a mention on the evening news. I'm not exaggerating. According to research by Cerulli Associates, nearly $124 trillion in assets is set to change hands through 2048. Let that number breathe for a second. $124 trillion. The entire U.S. GDP was roughly $27.4 trillion in 2023, meaning the wealth being transferred is something like 3 times that. This isn't a footnote in the financial story of our generation. This is the story, and almost nobody is talking about it the right way. So here's how most people frame this. When the great wealth transfer gets mentioned, and it does sometimes, the take is almost always optimistic. Millennials and Gen Z are going to inherit trillions. The younger generations are finally catching a break. This massive pile of boomer wealth is going to trickle down and fix the generational inequality that's defined the last 30 years. That's the headline version. And honestly, it's not exactly wrong, but it's so incomplete it might as well be. Because what's actually happening underneath this story is something far messier, far more unequal, and far more consequential than any headline suggests. Let me show you what I mean. Baby boomers currently hold about 51.8% of the country's total wealth, around $78 trillion. That's a wild concentration in one generation. And the transfer from boomers and the older silent generation to Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z is already moving at roughly $1 trillion a year in bequests and living gifts. And it's going to accelerate. Hard. Here's where it gets real. On January 1st, 2026, the leading edge of the baby boom hit age 80. Boomer deaths are expected to climb from 2.6 million per year today to 4 million annually by 2037, peaking somewhere in the mid-2040s. So what looks like a steady stream right now is about to become a flood. But here's the part the headlines keep skipping. More than 50% of the total transfer, roughly $62 trillion, is expected to come from high net worth and ultra high net worth households, which together make up only 2% of all households. Read that again slowly. Half of everything being transferred flows from 2% of families. Nobody teaches you this. The great wealth transfer isn't some democratic windfall where everyone gets a share. It's an enormous, compounding generational amplification of inequality that was already bad. Rich families pass more wealth to heirs who were already richer. The less wealthy majority passes down far less, or sometimes nothing at all. Surveys show 37% of people aged 55 to 64 don't plan to leave behind any money at all. Another 26% expect to leave less than $10,000. Think about that. Nearly 2/3 of older Americans will pass down essentially nothing, while the top 2% passes down tens of trillions. So when you hear the great wealth transfer, what it really means is this: the greatest acceleration of concentrated wealth in American history. For most families, this isn't a windfall story. It's an inequality story with good PR. Now let me tell you about the piece that I genuinely think nobody sees coming. And this is the part I find myself thinking about at like 2 in the morning, honestly. Gen X, long overshadowed by the much larger boomer generation, is projected to inherit nearly $1.4 trillion per year over the next decade. That's Gen X. The forgotten generation. Squeezed between two cultural juggernauts, they're about to receive the largest immediate inheritance in U.S. history. But here's what makes this interesting. Gen X isn't who most people picture when they imagine an inheritance recipient. The average Gen Xer is in their mid-40s to late 50s right now, already in peak earning years. Many already own homes. They're not 25-year-olds who need a starter boost. Their whole financial life has been defined by volatility. They lost 38% of their median net worth between 2007 and 2010, a steeper drop than any other generation, which made them understandably anxious and pragmatic about money. So when a generation that's financially anxious, already established, and extremely risk-aware suddenly receives trillions of dollars, what do they actually do with it? That question is, I think, the most underanalyzed economic variable of the next decade. According to a Merrill Lynch survey, younger investors between 21 and 42 are less confident in traditional investments. They think above-average returns from stocks and bonds are increasingly unlikely, and they lean harder toward private equity, private debt, and direct company investments. Here's the uncomfortable math. If even a fraction of the $14 trillion flowing to Gen X over the next decade moves away from traditional public markets, the index funds and bond portfolios boomers favored, the effect on stock valuations, bond yields, and real estate could be profound. Not catastrophic, but deeply reshaping. Equities grew 27% and real estate surged 39% from 2020 to 2023. Total U.S. household wealth jumped from $108 trillion to $154 trillion during that stretch. A huge chunk of that wealth is now sitting in boomer hands, parked in the exact asset classes that younger inheritors are most skeptical of. What happens when the biggest holders of those assets age out and the new owners want something different? And then there's the millennial side of this, which is its own complicated mess. U.S. millennials will ultimately inherit $46 trillion by 2048, but they've faced a brutal accumulation environment. $1.5 trillion in collective student debt, 2 recessions before age 40, and a housing market where median prices rose over 400% between 1990 and 2024 while incomes crawled. Most people think, great, millennials get their inheritance and the inequality problem sorts itself out. I think that completely misses the point. Research from Citizens Bank found that 51% of millennials planning to receive an inheritance said they'd use it to pay off debt first. Not investing, not building. Paying off debt they racked up just trying to live a normal life that prior generations took for granted. That's what happens when financial pressure compounds over decades. You don't inherit and thrive, you inherit and survive. And the wealth gap between rich millennials and everyone else in their generation is actually the largest of any generation. So even within this supposedly lucky group that inherits $46 trillion, the distribution is brutally unequal. The average millennial still has 30% less wealth at age 35 than boomers had at the same age. The ones who inherit the most are largely the ones who need it at least. There's also a piece of this that gets almost zero attention. And honestly, I think it might be the most structurally significant part of the whole thing. Around $54 trillion will first pass to surviving spouses before eventually moving between generations. And nearly $40 trillion of those spousal transfers will go to widowed women from the boomer and older generations. $40 trillion. Flowing to a demographic that's been historically underserved, underestimated, and underadvised by the financial industry. Which is wild when you think about it. If wealth managers can actually reach these women and help them move from cash savings into real investment, the downstream effects on capital markets could be massive. But here's the thing. Women have traditionally been overlooked by wealth managers. which is probably a big reason many kept their wealth in more conservative positions to begin with. And both younger investors and women have historically shown stronger preferences towards sustainable and diversity-focused investing. There's a real shift in ESG preferences already showing up in Gen X compared to boomers. So you've got the largest wealth transfer in history flowing toward the exact people most likely to redirect capital toward different values and different priorities. That's not a small thing. That's a reordering. I want to be straight with you about something before we wrap this up. The tidal wave I keep referring to isn't one single event. It's the annual acceleration of this transfer as boomer deaths climb sharply through the late 2020s and into the 2030s. According to the latest UBS Billionaire Ambitions report, 91 heirs inherited a record $297.8 billion in 2025 alone, up 36% from the year before. At the billionaire level, this is already happening at breathtaking speed. That pushed the number of multi-generational billionaires to 860, with total assets of $4.7 trillion. But the wave I keep thinking about isn't the billionaire wave, it's the middle wave. The tens of millions of ordinary families about to receive money they didn't plan for, from parents and grandparents who didn't plan adequately for the transfer either. Some experts argue millennials are genuinely ill-prepared to manage this wealth, and that by the time they inherit, many will be in their 40s and may not have the financial foundation to deploy it wisely. And data from the National Association of Realtors shows that in 2025, the share of first-time homebuyers dropped 21%, with the average buyer age hitting a record high of 40. The generational financial squeeze is still tightening, even as the transfer accelerates. So here's the paradox at the center of all of this. The wealth is enormous. The transfer is real. And for most American families, it may arrive too late in too small an amount to too financially depleted a recipient to actually change anything the way the headlines promise. When you see this clearly, really clearly, the great wealth transfer stops looking like a rising tide lifting all boats. It starts looking like a flood that lifts the biggest yachts highest, nudges the middle boat sideways, and leaves most people watching from the shore wondering what all the celebration was about. That's the tidal wave nobody sees coming. Not the size of the number, the shape of who it hits. And what you do with that understanding, whether you're a family trying to plan, an investor trying to position, or just someone trying to make sense of where things are heading. It all starts with seeing the wave clearly before it gets here.